Hey guys, Tactics here and welcome back to the channel. This week's beta build was delayed a bit with the pre-patch launching early this week to mixed results, but hopefully you guys have been able to log in and play around with the squish characters, new customization options, and the new leveling experience. We do have a lot of changes to the beta in this week's build, so let's just hop right into it, starting with the water nerfs. Now this was announced shortly after last week's beta build, but pretty much water now kind of ramps up, so it starts slower and regens your mana slower at the beginning, and it goes up over time. Pretty much this is just a direct nerf to taking a quick sip in either dungeons or like arena matches. I'm not totally sure why this is being changed, as personally I don't see it as much of an issue, especially not in Mythic Plus, but maybe PvPers have a different opinion. Let me know. Next, in terms of class stuff, we have changes to a bunch of classes, so let's start off with the Death Knight. So Death Knight saw nerfs to both Frost and Unholy this week. A two-handed Frost saw its Obliterate modifier nerfed a little bit from 35% down to 30%, as well as a nerf to Obliterate itself, just a small nerf to Obliterate itself. Pillar of Frost also saw a nerf down to a 12-second duration from 15 seconds, and its cooldown was actually increased as well from 45 seconds to a minute. At the same time, Unholy saw nerfs to a couple of talents in both Unholy Blight and Unholy Pact, which both just saw damage nerfs. Moving on from DKs, we have Druids. Now Druids actually saw a few buffs this week. So balanced Druids, as you can see here, this aura modifier went from negative 18% to negative 8%, so effectively that's a 10% bump in their damage and healing done to these modified spells. Now we also saw buffs to a couple of talents for balanced Druid. So Soul of the Forest saw just straight buffs to both the Wrath Astral Power generation and the area of effect damage on Starfire, and then they saw a buff to the haste effect on Star-Lord, but a nerf to its duration. So net, not sure on that one yet, but overall should be interesting to test out. We also saw another aura modifier increase to Feral Druids, so up from 15 to 20%, so just a flat 5% damage and healing buff on these spells here. Guardians also saw a buff to Frenzied Regen, now back up to its BFA numbers of 24% from 18%, as well as Pulverize, which had kind of been left in the dust when Tooth and Claw was implemented. This is a nice buff to see, up to 35% damage reduction from 20%, but it also saw a cooldown increase to 45 seconds to compensate. Restoration Druids actually saw a modifier nerf, so they got a flat negative 20% aura on their Sunfire. Moving on from Druids, we have changes to Fire Mage. Fire Mage saw a buff to several of their abilities in Fire Blast, Fireball, Flame Strike, and Pyroblast. Overall, they're not performing too great on the beta, so they definitely needed these buffs, but I'm not sure this is enough to make them viable compared to the other specs of Mage. From Mages, we do have a buff to Holy Paladins. So Holy Shock actually saw a pretty significant cooldown nerf, or buff, sorry, from 9 seconds down to 7.5 seconds. Now the talent Sanctified Wrath was nerfed to compensate, only the cooldown reduction was nerfed, so this is actually net neutral on the cooldown, so its base cooldown will still be 4.5 seconds if you take the Sanctified Wrath cooldown. Moving on from Holy Paladin, we do have changes to Priest. So starting with Holy Priest, they saw a 5% aura modifier, similar to Balance or Feral, on a bunch of their spells here. Personally, I don't think this is going to fix a lot of their issues. It's just a 5% throughput increase, and most of their issues, at least in Mythic Plus, was their fragility and their low mobility, which this doesn't do anything to address. On top of the changes to Holy, we also saw changes to both Shadow and Disc in a Shadow Fiend buff. It now lasts 15 seconds, up from 10 seconds, as well as a change to the Schism talent for Disc, where it now deals more initial damage, but it gives you less spell damage amplification, so this is going to be a net nerf to that talent. Moving on from Priest, we do have Rogue Changes. Now they saw an interesting change to Slice and Dice, where it no longer grants attack speed, and now grants 10% energy regeneration. At first glance, I've got to think this is a buff to Slice and Dice, but I'm not much of a Rogue player, so let me know what you guys think about this change. We also saw buffs to Assassination, The talent Venom Rush now refunds 8 energy when you use Mutilate against a poison target, up from 5. Moving on to Outlaw, they actually saw a nerf to Blade Flurry, which is now 40% attack damage, down from 120%. But they did see a buff to Roll the Bones, which now only costs 25 energy from 50 energy, which makes that feel a whole lot better. Subtlety Rogues also saw a slight nerf to their talent Enveloping Shadows, which is now only giving you cooldown reduction of 0.5 seconds per combo point, down from 1 second. So it's just a pretty decent nerf to the cooldown reduction you can get on Shadow Dance, which is definitely needed. They had very, very high uptime on Shadow Dance currently on the beta, so this was definitely needed there. Moving on, we have some buffs to Resto Shaman's Earth Shield and the corresponding talent Surge of Earth. So pretty much it gives you now a 20% healing increase, and also got a slight modifier increase to 1.2 up from 1.1. So it's just going to be healing for a little bit more and letting Shamans pump out a little more single target healing. Surge of Earth also had its target reduced to 3 from 6, but got 2.5 times the spell power scaling, which will make it a lot more noticeable, at least in Mythic Plus. Shamans in general also saw a buff to the Fey Transfusion Covenant ability, which now does 40% healing of all damage, up from 15%. So that's a pretty sizable buff to that Covenant ability. Moving on, we have some nerfs to Destruction Warlocks, who saw a couple talent nerfs here with Reign of Chaos, and now having a chance reduced to 15% from 20%, and only lasting 8 seconds instead of 10, and a nerf to Roaring Blaze, which only increases damage to the target by 25% from 30%. Now, the last class we saw changes, of course, Warriors Fury saw a pretty decent buff here. They saw attack power buffs to Bloodthirst, Raging Blow, and Whirlwind, and they also saw a slight buff to Single-Minded Fury, which now has a 12% damage increase, up from 10. Now, the other big change that happened in this build was legendaries. So shortly after last week's build, Blizzard put out this blue post here saying that they weren't really happy with where legendaries were at and they wanted to buff a bunch of them. And that is exactly what they did this week. So a lot of legendaries saw buffs. Literally every single class in the game saw legendary changes this week. Mostly buffs, but there were a few nerfs to some outlier legendaries. Now, I'm not going to read each one out, as that's going to make this video super long, and I learned from last week's video, which was a bit too long. So instead, I will link in the description to all the legendary changes, so you guys can check out if all the changes for your class or spec in particular. Now, I did want to take a quick minute to just talk about changes to a few neutral legendaries, as this affects multiple classes, and a few of them actually got totally reworked. So first, we have Echo of Irnar. Basically, now this gives yourself a 5% damage and healing buff, and can also echo to up to 3 allies, giving them a 5% damage buff, whereas previously, it only gave 1 ally a 10% damage and healing buff. It's definitely much more useful than it was before. I don't know if this is going to actually get any use at all, but definitely way better than the previous iteration. Third Eye of the Jailer, which was previously the Maw only legendary, got changed to work outside of the Maw now. So it gives you a stacking primary stat buff for 10 seconds, increasing by 1 second every time you get a stack. And this duration is just buffed in the Maw. At first glance, it seems like it could be okay for Mythic Plus, but if you look into it, like 10-second duration is just way too short for you to actually reliably keep it up in Mythic Plus. And that's if it refreshed the entire duration on a new stack, which this does not. So in general, I don't think this is going to see much use at all. Finally, we saw changes to Vitality Sacrifice. Now, this was a legendary that actually saw a lot of use by tanks on the beta, so it's interesting to see this changed. It was quite powerful before. We'll have to see how it is now, but pretty much it got changed into a pseudo Vengeance, if you're familiar with how Vengeance worked back in the Mists of Pandaria expansion. So basically, the tanks will get a damage and healing buff based on damage taken. In this case, it's capped at 9% damage and healing buff for 20 seconds, and this will occur every 30 seconds. Now, the key unknown here is it just says taking significant damage. So we're not sure really yet how much damage you need to take to get that max buff, and that is going to really say what the power of this legendary is. Right now we just don't know, so it's going to require a lot of testing on the beta to actually see if this is worthwhile in taking for tanks. But that pretty much wraps it up for this week's beta roundup, guys. Thank you so much for watching. As always, if you enjoyed this video and are interested in seeing more Warcraft content, please like and subscribe. I'll be putting out a video looking at healers on the beta in the next few days, so keep an eye out for that. You can also follow me on Twitter or check me out on Twitch, both at Tactics. Thank you once again for watching, and I will see you in the next video.